Deep inside a Nevada hillside, where most men saw only ruin, a 7-year-old girl knelt at the edge of a turquoise pond and watched light pour down through a crack in the earth above. The water sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars. She didn't know yet that what floated in that water would save her family. It was the spring of 1892, and Amos Pike had spent 67 years learning one stubborn truth. The things other people throw away are often the very things worth keeping. He'd seen it in salvaged wagon wheels, in mended harnesses, in friendships nobody else bothered to tend. He didn't know yet that the most important lesson of his life was waiting for him at the bottom of a flooded, forgotten mine. The town of Coyote Gap sat low between two ridges in northern Nevada, and the kind of place the railroad had passed by and the rain mostly forgot. In the spring of 1892, it was a town of dust and diminished hopes, its streets lined with the bleached storefronts of men who had come for silver and stayed too long after it was gone. Amos and Lydia Pike had arrived in Coyote Gap 6 months earlier, having sold nearly everything they owned to settle the debts their late son Daniel had left behind. Daniel and his wife Margaret were gone, a fever that moved faster than any doctor could ride, and what remained of the Pike family was the two of them and 2 small children who needed feeding, schooling, and above all, a reason to believe things could be all right. Ben was 10, dark-eyed and serious, the kind of boy who watched how a latch worked before he touched it. He had his father's hands, and already calloused from helping with any task Amos would permit. Millie was 7, round-cheeked, prone to singing to herself while she worked, and absolutely certain that her grandfather could fix anything in the world if given enough time and a decent length of wire. Amos loved them both so fiercely it sometimes sat in his chest like something too big to breathe around. They were renting a cramped back room above the Coyote Gap feed store, paying with the last of their cash reserves and a growing line of credit they could not long maintain. Lydia stretched every meal like a woman performing a quiet miracle. Beans became 3 dishes. A heel of bread became breakfast for 4. She never complained. She simply calculated. Amos spent his mornings at the county land office, studying the listings the clerk kept in a dusty leather binder. Most parcels were beyond any sum he could imagine. And then, one gray Tuesday, a listing appeared that no one else had bothered to circle. The Dunmore Mine, flooded, considered valueless, available for $31. Amos read it twice, very slowly, and then he asked to see the property map. The county agent, a thin man named Garvey who wore his skepticism openly, drove Amos out to the property in a rattling buckboard. The mine sat into the side of a low hill, its entrance framed by old timber supports gone silver gray with age. Inside, the main tunnel sloped gently downward past abandoned ore carts and rusting tools until it opened into a wide natural cavern, and there, filling the lower portion of that cavern, was the pond. Amos stood at its edge and simply looked. The water was a vivid, impossible turquoise, the kind of color that had no business being underground. Light fell from a natural crack 50 feet above, and where it struck the water, something glittered. Thousands of tiny points of light, suspended just beneath the surface, drifting like slow-moving snow. He didn't say anything to Lydia that night. He sat at their small table after the children were asleep and turned the property map over and over in his hands, the way he turned difficult thoughts. Slowly, from every angle. The dry section of the tunnel was sound enough. Timbers old, but holding. Enough room for beds, a stove, shelves. The cavern itself was enormous, naturally ventilated through the crack above, which also admitted a long blade of afternoon sunlight. It was not by any ordinary measure a home. but $31, and they had 42 left. The next morning, he took Lydia back to the mine alone before the children were up. He didn't speak on the drive. She had learned in 40 years of marriage not to press him when he was still thinking. He led her through the entrance tunnel, past the old rail tracks and the slumped ore carts, down to the cavern's edge, and he let the place speak for itself. Lydia looked at the pond for a long time. "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant it. "But Amos, the children." "Dry section is solid. I checked every support. Children need sunlight, a yard, a school. Coyote Gap School is 2 miles. Ben can walk it. The crack in the roof lets in more light than you'd think come afternoon." She was quiet for a moment. "People will talk." "People are already talking," he said. "They've been pitying us since October. I'd rather give them something harder to understand." She studied his face, reading him the way she always had. "You saw something in that water." He hesitated. "I'm not sure yet what I saw. Could be nothing." "But you don't think it's nothing?" "No," he admitted. "I don't." That evening, he brought Ben to the mine at last light, specifically to watch what the boy noticed without prompting. Ben walked to the pond's edge, crouched down, and stared into the water for almost a minute without speaking. Then he said, "Grandpa, those little shiny bits, are those what I think they are?" Amos crouched beside him. "What do you think they are?" Ben looked up. "Silver." Amos nodded once, carefully. Maybe so." They signed the deed on a Thursday morning. Garvey handed over the papers with the expression of a man performing a charity service, and the few people who witnessed the transaction in the land office doorway exchanged the particular look of a town watching someone make a mistake they are too polite to name aloud. Amos signed his name in his neat, deliberate hand. That afternoon, the 4 of them loaded their possessions onto a borrowed wagon and drove out of Coyote Gap toward the low hill in the distance. Millie sat in the back and watched the town grow smaller. "Is that our house now?" she asked. "That's our house," Lydia told her. What nobody in Coyote Gap expected, not Garvey, not the men at the hardware store who had sold Amos a few supplies with poorly concealed pity, and not the women who had been kind to Lydia in that specific tender way people are kind to those they believe have run out of options, was that Lydia Pike was going to transform a silver mine into a home. She had done it before in harder circumstances. She had always believed that a place became home not through its walls, but through what a family chose to put inside them. The first week was the hardest, and also, in its own strange way, one of the best the family had known in months. The dry upper tunnel and the wide mouth of the cavern became, under Lydia's direction, something no one who had ever worked the Dunmore mine could have anticipated. She started with the floor, sweeping years of grit and old mineral dust back toward the lower end of the tunnel, then spreading 2 salvaged rugs she had packed in the bottom of the wagon, and their bed frames went up against the cavern wall, separated by a length of canvas she hung from an iron spike and which she had embroidered years ago with a running pattern of small yellow flowers. Millie declared this the finest curtain in Nevada and stood beside it every morning while she brushed her hair. The cook stove was the hardest piece to move, requiring Amos and Ben and 2 hours of careful labor with a plank sled and a rope rigged around a timber support. When it was finally in position and the stovepipe fed up through a wedged opening Amos chiseled at the base of the ventilation crack, Lydia declared it perfect, and it was. On the first evening meal cooked underground, a pot of bean soup with a strip of salt pork and the last of their cornmeal pressed into cakes on the iron surface, smelled so good in the enclosed stone space that Ben said it seemed a shame to eat it, because then the smell would be gone. Millie arranged her small collection of possessions on a shelf, Amos cut from a plank of old timber, 2 smooth river stones she called her jewels, a corn husk doll with braided hair, a blue tin cup, and a piece of quartz she had found near the entrance that caught light in interesting ways. Amos built her a small bench beside the pond's edge so she could sit and look at the water whenever she pleased. She went to it every afternoon. The pond was extraordinary. In the flat morning hours, it sat perfectly still, its turquoise color so concentrated and clear that it looked painted. Then, when the afternoon light fell through the crack above, slanting in at roughly 2 o'clock and spreading across the water for nearly an hour, the entire surface came alive. The suspended silver particles, too fine to see individually in dim light, caught the beam and scattered it into a shifting, slow-moving constellation that moved across the cavern walls and ceiling like the world's most patient fireworks display. Millie called it the silver weather. She would sit on her bench and hold her hand into the light and watch the reflections move across her palm. Amos had begun his observations quietly, methodically, the way he approached every problem he intended to solve. He had brought with him several pieces of old cotton cloth, 2 shallow tin pans, and a cast-iron pot. He had no instruments, no chemistry training, no prior experience with mineral extraction, beyond what he had learned working a hand placer claim 30 years earlier on a creek outside of Elko. But he had careful eyes and a habit of noticing what other men ignored. He began by simply submerging a piece of cloth in the pond and leaving it overnight. In the morning, he pulled it out, laid it on a flat piece of rock near the ventilation crack, and let the sun dry it slowly. By afternoon, a faint but unmistakable dusty shimmer clung to the cloth. He rubbed a small portion of it between his fingers. It left a soft metallic smear. Ben was watching. He always was. "It stays on the cloth," the boy said. "Cloth catches what water carries," Amos said. "Water evaporates, but the cloth doesn't." Ben thought about this with the focused intensity that Amos had come to recognize as genuine understanding in the making. So if you put enough cloths in the water, you collect what the water's been holding all this time. Amos folded the cloth carefully. Maybe. It was not a plan yet. It was only a question. But it was the right question. Through the weeks of April and into May, Amos worked his experiment with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that rushing a careful thing was the surest way to ruin it. He constructed a series of cloth filters stretched between wooden frames he built from strips of old crating timber and cut down broom handles. He suspended these at intervals along the pond's shallow end, where a faint natural current caused the water to drift in a slow, consistent direction from the deeper middle toward the cavern wall. The silver particles, he reasoned, were not evenly distributed. They collected in still places, around submerged ledges, along the pond's margins where the current slowed and deposited whatever it carried. He was right. After 10 days of cloth filters, he collected each frame with care, spread the wet cloth on flat stones in the afternoon light, and waited for it to dry. The residue that remained was not dramatic. No gleaming heap, no bright ingot of obvious wealth. It was a fine gray-silver dust that gathered in the cloth's fibers and released only partially when he brushed and scraped it. But it was real, and it accumulated. Ben became his essential assistant in this phase, not the dangerous parts which Amos kept entirely to himself, but the maintenance work that a careful 10-year-old could perform reliably, resubmerging the frames each morning, checking that the wooden supports had not shifted overnight, reporting any change in the water's color or clarity. Ben did this with a seriousness that made Amos quietly proud. The boy kept a small log, a few lines of pencil in the back of his school copybook, recording what he observed each day. When Amos discovered this, he didn't comment on it directly, but he made sure from that point on to explain his reasoning aloud as he worked, knowing Ben was listening and noting everything. Millie contributed in her own way. She had decided that the pond needed a proper name and had settled on Lake Millie, which she announced formally one evening at supper, and which everyone accepted without debate. Because there are some decisions in a family that a 7-year-old simply gets to make. She also took it upon herself to bring Amos his morning coffee before he began his daily check of the filters, carrying the tin cup with both hands and the absolute concentration of someone transporting something critical. And this small ritual became a thing Amos looked forward to in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. Lydia, meanwhile, had not been idle. She had traded 3 afternoons of cooking for the neighbors, a widow named Mrs. Hartwell on the East Road who kept chickens, in exchange for 6 fresh eggs a week, and more importantly, information. Mrs. Hartwell talked freely, and what she said painted a clear picture of Coyote Gap's opinion of the Pike family's living arrangement. People think Amos has lost his sense," she told Lydia plainly, because she was that kind of woman. "They say a man his age shouldn't be dragging children into a hole in the ground." Lydia thanked her for the eggs and said nothing unkind in return. By late May, Amos had accumulated enough dried silver residue to attempt the next step, and this was the part that required him to work alone, at a distance from the others, in the broad open space near the mine's entrance, where the ventilation was strongest and the light best. He had read, over several evenings in the county land records room where old mining reports were kept, enough about small-scale silver smelting to feel confident in the basic process. He borrowed a small crucible from the hardware store in Coyote Gap, told the proprietor he was doing an assay experiment, and paid the deposit without elaborating. What came out of the crucible on the last Friday of May, after 3 careful hours of work, a small fire of hardwood charcoal, and a mold fashioned from a folded piece of sheet iron, was not large. It was a silver bar roughly the length of his thumb. He held it in his palm for a long time before he went inside to show Lydia. She held it the way people hold things they've been hoping for and didn't quite believe would arrive. "How much?" she asked. "At current silver prices," he said. "A bar this size is about $4.30. She looked up. "And how long did it take?" 3 weeks. First attempt, learning as I went." He paused. "I can go faster now. Better frames, longer soak time, more efficient drying. I think I can produce 1 bar every 10 days, and maybe 8. Lydia set the bar down on the kitchen shelf, next to Millie's quartz stone. She stood back and looked at them together. "Then we're going to be all right," she said. June arrived and brought with it 2 complications Amos had not anticipated. The first was physical. His hands, always reliable, had begun to trouble him with the kind of deep ache that settled in joints that had done hard work for too many decades. The fine motor tasks of filter construction and residue collection weren't beyond him, but they were slower now. And on mornings after a cold night, the first hour of work was simply an exercise in patience while his fingers decided to cooperate. He said nothing about this to Lydia, and she said nothing about having noticed, because they had long ago arrived at an understanding about which kinds of difficulty were productive to discuss and which were better simply managed. The second complication arrived on horseback. His name was Dobbins, Carroll Dobbins, and he was a land agent from Reno, employed by a mining interest group that had, in the previous year, quietly purchased several of the old worked-out silver claims in the Coyote Gap district for a fraction of their original value. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, tethered his horse at the mine entrance, and walked in as though he had every right to do so, which, to be clear, he did not. Amos heard the hoofbeats and came out of the cavern to meet him in the tunnel. Dobbins was perhaps 50, well-dressed by local standards, and carried about him the specific confidence of a man who had found, through experience, that most people deferred to confidence as though it were authority. He took in the domestic arrangements, the rugs, the hanging canvas divider, the children's shelf, the stove, the smell of Lydia's supper beginning on the iron surface, with an expression carefully arranged to conceal what he thought of it. "Mr. Pike," he said, consulting a small notebook, "I represent a group of gentlemen with interests in the old Dunmore mineral corridor. We've been reviewing the district claims and understand you recently acquired this property." "I did," Amos said, "at county auction, legally registered." "Absolutely. No question of that." Dobbins smiled pleasantly. "I'm here to make you an offer. Straightforward transaction. My clients would purchase the property from you at twice what you paid, $62, which I believe represents a considerable return on your investment." Amos looked at him steadily. "What's their interest in a flooded mine?" Dobbins gave a small, practiced shrug. "The corridor itself has value for surveying purposes, access easements, potential drainage work. Nothing to concern you." It was a rehearsed answer, the kind that was designed to end inquiry rather than satisfy it. Amos had heard men use that tone before, in horse trading, in credit arrangements, in the polite conversations that preceded someone attempting to take something from you. "I appreciate the offer," Amos said. "The property isn't for sale." Dobbins's pleasant expression remained perfectly in place. "Of course. Think it over. I'll be in Coyote Gap another few days." He passed his card across. After Dobbins had gone, Amos stood in the tunnel mouth for a while, watching the dust of the horse's departure settle. Ben had appeared at his elbow silently, the way he always did. "He wanted the mine," Ben said. "Yes. Why? He said it was for surveying." "That's what he said." Ben was quiet for a moment. "Do you believe him?" Amos tucked the card into his shirt pocket without looking at it. "No," he said. He went back inside and said nothing to alarm the children, but that evening, after they were asleep, he told Lydia everything, and they sat together at the small table and spoke in low voices for a long time. Dobbins returned the following Thursday, and this time with a second man, a younger fellow who carried a leather satchel and the look of someone trained to assess value without showing that he was doing so. He asked to see the cavern. Amos, who had learned enough about property law in the county records room to know that he was within his rights to decline, did so politely but clearly. Dobbins was less pleasant this time. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the original Dunmore Mine Charter, filed in 1871, contained a mineral rights reservation clause that he believed might still be in force, and that his client's legal representatives were reviewing. He left before Amos could respond fully, which was, Amos recognized, intentional. That evening was a difficult one. Amos rode to the county land records office early the next morning and spent 4 hours in the back room with the original filing documents for the Dunmore claim. His eyes were not as sharp as they'd been, and the handwriting in the 1871 charter was cramped and inconsistent, but he read every word twice. The mineral rights clause was real. It had been a standard provision in the original territory of Nevada charters, a reservation allowing the original claim filers' assigns to retain subterranean mineral rights for a period of 20 years following abandonment of active operations. By Amos's reading, the original claim had been abandoned in 1869. 20 years from 1869 was 1889. By 1892, the clause had expired. But he was not a lawyer. He spent 2 more days considering his options. The concern was not just legal, it was financial. So he and Lydia had nearly exhausted their reserves in the mine purchase and setup. The silver production, while real and growing, had not yet accumulated to a sum that could sustain a legal challenge. 3 bars of silver did not hire a solicitor in Reno. What he had not counted on was Coyote Gap itself. Mrs. Hartwell, who had seemed to Lydia a source of gossip and eggs and nothing more, turned out to know Carol Dobbins's history in the district very well. Over an afternoon visit at the farm, she told Lydia that Dobbins had used the identical tactic, the mineral rights clause, to pressure 2 other properties in the previous year. One owner had sold quickly and cheaply, the other had stayed, and ultimately heard nothing further because the clause had, on review, expired in each case. "He's a bluffer," Mrs. Hartwell said flatly. "He finds the frightened ones." Lydia brought this home like a practical tool and handed it to Amos over supper. More help arrived from an unexpected quarter. The hardware proprietor in Coyote Gap, a broad-shouldered man named Whitfield, who had sold Amos the crucible, and who had never entirely managed to keep the curiosity out of his face when Amos came in, stopped him on the street the following day. "Heard Dobbins visited you," he said. "Heard you sent him off." "Good." He paused. "Old Dunmore mineral clauses all expired by 1890. I asked the same question myself 2 years ago when I was thinking of buying that ridge parcel. The county clerk will tell you the same." Amos visited the clerk that afternoon. She confirmed it in writing, stamped and dated, in under 10 minutes. He rode home in the late afternoon light with the document folded in his coat pocket and a feeling in his chest that he recognized, after so many months, as something very close to security. The mine was theirs. The water was theirs. What floated in that water was theirs. He did not tell the children about Dobbins at all. Some weights, he felt, were for adults to carry alone. 3 days after he received the clerk's confirmation, Amos's hands failed him at the worst possible moment. He was managing the smelting fire, the careful, concentrated work he permitted no one else near, when his right hand seized with a cramp so sudden and severe that he dropped the crucible handle. The molten material did not spill dangerously, but the bar was ruined, and more than that, he sat down on the ground outside the mine entrance in the afternoon heat and looked at his shaking hand and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has never lied to himself for long, that he could not do this work alone indefinitely. He sat there for a while. The Nevada afternoon was loud with insects and the dry sound of the wind moving through the scrub. Somewhere inside the mine, he could hear Millie singing to herself, a small, tuneless song she had invented about a horse named Captain, and the sound of Ben moving a cloth frame along the pond's edge, doing his careful rounds the way Amos had taught him. He looked at his hand. He was 67 years old. He had 2 children in his care who had already lost everything they should not have had to lose before they were grown, and he had a wife who had followed him into a mine without a single complaint because she trusted him absolutely, and he had built something here, something real and small and precarious, out of practically nothing. He could not afford to be the point of failure. He had never, in his life, asked for help with anything he believed he could do himself. It was the thing Lydia called his most useful quality and his worst habit, depending on the day. He sat with that knowledge for a long time. Then Ben appeared in the tunnel mouth, squinting out at the light. "Grandpa, supper's almost ready." Amos looked at the boy for a moment. "Come sit with me a minute," he said. He told Ben the truth, the careful, age-appropriate version of it, that the work was producing real silver, that his hands needed more rest than the work was allowing, that he needed help designing a better system that would let the collection process do more of the work on its own instead of requiring so much from him each day. Ben listened with complete seriousness. Then he said, "The frames need to be bigger, and if we built a settling rack, the residue could collect without you having to wring the cloths out." Amos looked at him. "Show me what you mean." They spent 3 days planning and 4 days building, and what came out of those 7 days was the best work Amos Pike believed he had ever done, not because it was technically impressive, though it was, but because he had not done it alone. Ben's settling rack was, in concept, beautifully simple, a series of flat wooden trays, tilted slightly and stacked at intervals, through which pond water could be scooped and poured by hand. As the water moved down through the trays and slowed, the silver particles, denser than water, but light enough to remain suspended in motion, would settle onto the tray surfaces and could be scraped off after drying. No prolonged cloth soaking, no wringing, no sustained grip work that aggravated Amos's hands. Amos improved it as they built, adding small grooves along the tray edges to capture runoff, fitting a scooping handle long enough for comfortable use, and treating the tray surfaces with a coating of boiled pine resin he had read about in an old mining report, which made them marginally smoother and easier to scrape clean. Ben sanded every joint. He was meticulous about it, more meticulous than Amos had been at 10, or perhaps simply differently meticulous, in the way the boy was meticulous about everything he cared about. He asked questions throughout, and Amos answered them honestly, and somewhere in those 4 days of building, the knowledge moved between them in the way knowledge between a grandfather and grandson should move, not as instruction, but as inheritance. Millie was in charge of carrying tools. She managed this task with an organizational intensity that suggested a future career in logistics, and she named each tool as she carried it, introducing the hammer. "This one's Henry." The plane, "This one is called Flat." And a particularly useful small rasp, the little grumpy one, with the same assurance she had brought to naming the pond. Nobody questioned this system. It seemed to work. When the settling rack was finished and placed along the pond's quiet margin, Amos ran the first test, while both children watched. He scooped 3 pans of pond water through the trays and let everything sit for 2 hours in the afternoon light. When he returned and scraped the dried tray surfaces with a flat piece of iron, the residue that came off was visibly, immediately more concentrated than anything the cloth filters had produced. Ben made a sound that was not quite a word and looked at his grandfather. "Did we make it better?" he asked. "Considerably," Amos said. The production rate accelerated through July and into August. 1 bar every 10 days became 1 bar every 6, and then, as Amos refined his smelting practice and the settling rack was adjusted twice more based on Ben's observations about where the residue concentrated most heavily, 1 bar every 5 days. Not a fortune, not a rush, but steady, reliable, to accumulating wealth in a form that could be converted to cash at the assay office in the county seat, which Amos began to visit monthly, always with the same quiet presentation and always with the same result. A fair price, paid without fuss, deposited at the Coyote Gap Merchant Bank in an account that grew by increments that Lydia tracked in a small green notebook with the same precision she had once applied to stretching meals. It was Lydia who eventually told Mrs. Hartwell. Not to boast, that was not Lydia's way, but because she liked the woman, and because she felt Mrs. Hartwell had earned an honest account of how things had gone. Mrs. Hartwell told the rest of Coyote Gap, as Mrs. Hartwell always did, and the town's opinion of the Pike family underwent a gradual, slightly sheepish revision. Garvey, the land agent, he encountered Amos on the street in late July and managed something close to a compliment. "Here you've done well with that property." Amos thanked him simply and did not elaborate. Whitfield at the hardware store began to ask Amos's opinion on matters unrelated to hardware in the way that towns identify quiet expertise once they stop being surprised by it. 2 families with children Ben's and Millie's ages had begun to invite them out on Sundays, which Lydia welcomed for the children's sake, and which led, by August, to an afternoon picnic near the creek that Ben would later say was one of the best days he remembered from that year. Carol Dobbins did not return. On the last Saturday of August, Amos and Lydia sat together at their table in the cavern, the real table now, and the oak one from their old house that Lydia had refused to sell and that they had stored at Mrs. Hartwell's place all spring. And Lydia opened the green notebook and set it between them. The numbers were plain and honest. The bank account held a balance that covered 6 months of reasonable expenses. The monthly silver production, at current prices, exceeded their monthly costs by a small but meaningful margin. The legal threat from Dobbins had evaporated. The property was theirs. Amos looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at the cavern around him. The evening light was fading in the crack above, and the pond sat in the gentle dimness, its turquoise color softened but not gone, a faint shimmer still moving slowly across its surface. The rugs were on the floor. The embroidered curtain hung between the sleeping spaces. Millie's shelf held its small collection of meaningful things, and Ben's school copybook was propped open on its corner, the latest careful entries visible from where Amos sat. "We did it," Lydia said softly. He reached across and covered her hand with his, the hand that ached in the mornings, the hand that had dropped a crucible handle and taught him that asking for help was not a defeat, but a form of wisdom. "We did," he said. On the first Sunday of September, the 4 of them sat together at the pond's edge as the afternoon light poured through the crack above and turned Lake Millie into a slow spinning mirror of silver and turquoise and gold. Millie held her palm up into the beam and watched the reflections move across her hand, the same as she had done since the first week they arrived. Ben sat beside Amos with his copybook open, writing something down with the focused seriousness that was entirely his own. The mine that no one had wanted, in the hands of the family no one had expected much from, was full of light.